Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and a really warm and effusive welcome to the Radical Solidarity Summit Day 4, hosted by Zeitz MOCAA. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us, as we have discussed over the last couple of days and interrogated what does radical solidarity mean, why is it important, and why is it important now? We've invited some extraordinary people to share their ideas with us. And today on our day 4, we're dealing with a thinking and kind of discussion around urban imaginaries, mobilities, and why so many borders. Just would like to go through our program for the rest of the day with you briefly. The panel discussion today will go on until 5:30 p.m. Standard South African time. We have about an hour and a half, after which directly I'm inviting Phokeng Setai, a curatorial assistant at Zeitz MOCAA, to introduce a listening session with a mixtape by Chimarenga titled FESTAC 77. After that, between 7:30 and 8 p.m. we'll have a break, and then from 8 to 8:20 p.m. Today there will be a reading by myself, where I will dip into writing by Ivan Vladislavich and Eben Venter. Just to kind of very briefly go through some of the house rules, just to say that we request that everyone remains respectful and open-minded, advise that you have been automatically muted, but that all questions can be sent via the Q&A feature here at Zoom, and we will answer your questions later in the discussion. You also have the chat box on the side of the screen, where you can also engage and let us know if you have any issues, and also speak to us. We would love to hear some more feedback, and you're welcome to also post on social media and tag us at Zeitz MOCAA. Very excited about today. Again, please engage with us. Any questions? The link for the listening session will be dropped in the chat later in our session, so you can navigate directly from here to that. It's a big pleasure to introduce some wonderful people with you. Very excited to welcome all of you, people that I have, if I haven't met previously in depth. Really extraordinary to have this opportunity to engage with you, but also people that I have walked a long journey with. So really great to all have you here today. A brief introduction to introduce you to Mpho Matsipa, who is a research wiser, a curator, a researcher at WISER, a curator and lecturer. She has written critical essays on art and architecture, and curated several exhibitions and discursive platforms, including African Mobilities at the Architecture Museum at the Pinakothek Moderne in Munich. She has also curated Studio X Johannesburg and the 11th International Architecture Exhibition and Venice Biennale. She teaches at the School of Architecture and Planning in South Africa, and has taught at Columbia University and Cooper Union in New York. She holds a PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, during which time she was a Fulbright scholar. Then also to introduce you to Edgar Pieterse, whose research and teaching gravitates around urban development politics, everyday culture, publics, radical social economies, responsive design, and adaptive governance systems. He is consulting editor for Cityscapes, an international biannual magazine on urbanism in the global south. Edgar is co-author with Abdul Malik Simone of New Urban Worlds, Inhabiting Dissonant Times from 2017, and recently co-edited books including Integration Syndicate, Shifting Cape Town's Social Spatial Debate, African Cities Reader 3, Land, Property and Value, Africa's Urban Revolution, and Rogue Urbanism, Emergent African Cities. He serves on the advisory board of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, LSE Cities, London, the Gauteng City Region Observatory in Joburg, among others. His current research is focused on flagship public projects, signaling a turnaround of fortunes in Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, Kigali, Lagos, Luanda, and Nairobi. A warm welcome to you, Edgar. And then Emeka Okereke is a Nigerian visual artist, writer, filmmaker, and DJ who lives and works between Lagos and Berlin. A past member of the renowned Nigerian photography collective Depth of Field, or DOF. He holds a master's degree from the Beaux-Arts de Paris and has exhibited in biennials and art festivals in cities across the world, notably Lagos, Bamako, Cape Town, London, Berlin, Bayreuth, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Brussels, Johannesburg, New York, Washington, Barcelona, Seville, Madrid, and Paris. In 2015, his work was exhibited at the 56th Venice Biennial in the context of an installation titled A Trans-African World Space. Okereke is the founder and artistic director of Invisible Borders Trans-African Project. He is also the founder and host of the Nkata podcast station. He served as a visiting lecturer and was conferred France's prestigious insignia of the Knight in the Order of Arts and Letters by the Ministry of Culture of France as recognition of his contribution in the discourses on art in Africa and France and the world at large. Very much welcome to you, Emeka. And then Zimbabwean-born Tavengwa is the co-founder, curator, and editor of Cityscapes magazine, a hybrid journal magazine print title focused on cities and urban life across Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. Each issue of the magazine presents nuanced stories and analysis focused on cities and urbanism across the South and the people working, thinking, and fighting to make them more livable and equitable. Tom has a background in architecture and museum design, art and architecture publishing. His work in the last 10 years has been focused exclusively on urban issues in the Global South as part of the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, where he is still a member of the Urban Humanities Cluster. Tao is currently a visiting fellow at LSE Cities, London School of Economics, and a research fellow at Max Planck Institute for Religious and Diversity Studies. He is a board member of Terraform's UR Books and is a member of the Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Awards Nominations Committee of the International Federation of Landscape Architects. A warm welcome to you, Tao. Each one of your respective practices has deeply and intently questioned and probed the issues being discussed in the session over a sustained period of time. And you have also invested in creating new platforms and organizations that further your work. And I'm also, from a conversation yesterday, institution making in itself is an act of solidarity. I would like to invite you to consider both the theoretical frameworks that occupy your practice, and then also hear from you, how does the work we do translate into praxis, especially as we're also talking in the framework of radical solidarity. Firstly, what does this phrase radical solidarity mean when we think about our cities, the conditions that its citizens or inhabitants negotiate, the systems that they are subjected to? How does solidarity become acts or actions or activist or activated? Simultaneously, let us also think about human movement, the way we move, voluntary and involuntary, and how our bodies require and make space. On the flip side of this, where there are also limitations and restrictions on movement and the occupation of land, how does legal or developmental frameworks, which also often implies violence, impact, governs, or rule us? What if these frameworks fail? If we talk about demarcations or limits or borders, let us also think about citizenship and nationhood as core to the way borders govern or define us. And then the broader context of this panel, can we also bring into the room discussion on freedom, emancipation, possibility, imagination, the imaginary of creativity and the effects and affects thereof on cultural expressions. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over first to Tao, if you want to start.
Thanks, Storm. I wasn't quite ready to go first. Hey, Edgar. And nice to meet Emeka. I've been following your work a long time. Mpho, what can I say? I just wanted to, so what I do is very simple. I'm essentially a fan of the other three guys and the sort of work that they do. I sort of get to more or less watch, and on one level, if there is stuff that feels really interesting, is sort of linked into the subject matter that, as you said earlier, I've been sort of very interested and focused on the last 12 years or so. We get to publish it. We work on this project called Cityscapes, which Edgar and I started up together with Sean O'Toole, who was a writer based in Cape Town in 2000, late 2010, early 2011. And part of why we started that project was informed by the graphic that perhaps everybody can see on screen right now. We're the African Center for Cities at UCT, and there were constant conversations about, you know, cities and urbanism. But what was really interesting was that the references constantly always seemed to lie elsewhere. And the ambition was obviously, you know, we're literally at a place called the African Center for Cities. And we're trying to, I suppose at that point, new relationships were beginning to form, and there was the ambition to have all these relationships across the continent and other parts of the world. But I think the easiest relationships that could be forged and the easiest references a lot of people had were constantly, you know, north. And I remember seeing an earlier version of this graphic, and it just blew my mind, because I think in one visual, it pretty much summed up the program. Just to explain very quickly, this is something that was done not too long ago, sort of showing in this particular instance, academic peer-reviewed journals, public books, and a lot of other academic outputs, and the relationships within academia that individuals and institutions have, as reflected in the sort of publishing that happens. These are both institutional and individual relationships. And what was interesting was that they also mirror, I think, largely the challenge we have on the continent. There's very little contact. This is from 2018. You'll see between the continent, within the continent, everything, if you were to zoom in closer, you'll see that those fine lines are all headed particularly to Europe from the continent, and very few of them sort of like actually cross into other parts of the country, but this is changing. There also are barely any sort of like networks that cut across from Africa to Latin America to Asia, etc. So our interest in this like very quirky project, which is neither journal, no magazine, it's just sort of like this weird thing, was to just do a little something that would, on some level, try to reconfigure or contribute towards reconfiguring this. And to your question, largely about solidarity, that's what sustained the project the last 10 years. We depend on like-minded people. We have few resources often. We're constantly looking for some. We have managed to do what personally I'm very proud of, the 10 issues we have done, which sort of crisscross the continent in terms of the subject matter, the people we work with, the stories we cover. We have on some level developed our own language that is very confidently African on the one scale, but is also very confidently global South, because I sort of tend to identify more regionally with that scope. I understand it better, and it excites me so much more, despite irony that I live in London at the moment. Also, we do other things. We do exhibitions. We try to bring people together constantly. That's actually been something that in the last few years we have done more and more of. So I could go on and on, but I'm very happy to sort of have a conversation with these three other people whose work I have looked at and admired a long time. Thanks, Storm.
Fantastic, Tao, and also great for introducing that graphic. Just for that, what we know when it becomes visible is again, it is quite a challenge to kind of process. But I'm going to ask Emeka to follow. Emeka, your position is also in a way to visualize the way we move, potentially through and around borders. So if you would like to go next.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice meeting all of you. Since 2009, that was the year I founded Invisible Borders. We have basically been bringing together visual artists, writers, photographers, filmmakers to make road trips across borders in the continent, but also beyond. In fact, it has, sort of like expanded beyond the notion of Africa being just about a continent. But of course, it is this utopia to touch on, the concept of Africa as a story of journeys, of married journeys, of how we have permeated the world and continue to do so. And I think that as we think of the narrative that is Africa, the one that has been imposed on us through, of course, the imposed cartography, that is the obvious manifestation of that. Mm-hmm. And you think that, what we call the Africa burden, right? Where you are in this double bind. You want to move forward, but you're like, okay, but you have to carry this narrative and this legacy. But how do you carry it forward? Mm-hmm. How do you think of slavery, colonialism, and even its counterpart, decolonialism, that we throw around these days? How do you think about that while, having at the back of your mind that you've also been empowered, with what it takes to propose a new way of being, a new world? That thing that Frantz Fanon, touched on, that what we are up against here is proposing a new way of being. So how do you deal with that double bind? I think that's, our preoccupation now. So in 2009, we started off, modestly, photographers not knowing what we're doing. And this is also very interesting because I think it's very unique also because it's coming from Nigerians, right? As opposed to South Africans. Because when I came to South Africa in 2008, I realized that everything is relies on the system. For instance, the photographers would need to be sure of, the gallery they work with for them to be photographers. And they already had a market photo workshop as a school. So everybody was sort of like coming out from that, it was already laid out. And it was so surprising because for us Nigerians, it's like, you don't have that. We have something we call personal work that we do on the side to fund our, we have commercial work to fund our personal work. It was really like a tangible language that we use, expression. So when we come together to show contact sheets, we call it personal work. But when you say personal work, we all know what we're talking about. It means that it's not that commercial fashion wedding that you've done. So the whole idea of funding again wasn't really a thing when we started. And that really helped a lot when we were putting together Invisible Borders, because we didn't wait for anyone. And I think that down the line, I'll come back to this as this, what we like to call guerrilla, way of doing it. I mean, Tara just, touched on it a little bit now, but I think it's also very important that we begin to see that as real value, and we really begin to give that the value that it deserves in our practice, in our process. Wake up, you don't wait for funding, you just do your thing. If we don't do more of that, we're not gonna, have anything. We're always going to be at the mercy of, like Tara has already shown in the slide. Again, we're all gonna be trooping to Europe and the West as an idea, West as a market. Anyway, so we started off that way, making those road trips. But again, you realize that what motivated us eventually over the years was also the experience of being on the road. Again, we were part of the project, but we are also the project, in the sense that we grew in it. Our minds expanded, and we became more confident in ourselves. And most importantly, in hindsight, you realize that this magic that happens when you take an idea and put it somewhere that, that is most unlikely. And then you see that it animates something. And then all of a sudden, it animates the social power of that place, of that space. And that's what we have been experiencing on the road, where you take an idea, you put it somewhere, and then all of a sudden, there is this social power that comes to life. And we've really benefited from that a lot, but in terms of motivation and in terms of coming back, I was like, wow, we want to get back to the road again. And so we started little by little creating artists, or sort of like nurturing artists who are roadside intellectuals. So Nick, my friend, Nick, the writer, I was with him 2 days ago, and he would say that his research is not a desktop research, that he's on the field guy. So yeah, that's it. It's more like that. So the research was on the field, boots dirty, but again, have all these amazing young writers, photographers, all thinking together on the road. And that's been it up until our last road trip in February 2020. It was in Bangladesh. The first time we were collaborating with, photographers and colleagues beyond the continent, Africa, to really make a road trip or conceive a road trip together. And this time around, it wasn't Africa in that sense. It was us engaging, other borders. So we traveled and made stops in 5 towns, or cities that were bordering, where Bangladesh borders India. And so we were creating work. Sometimes we cross because the border is a bit, the border stories are all complex. They all take on their own forms. It's so interesting in Bangladesh because sometimes it even takes on this form, a space of solidarity that we're talking about right now, where, the lines between India and Bangladesh blurs, but then it becomes a tourist place. Everybody come there to just make photos and hang out. We had moments like that. So, yeah. And that last road trip was really sort of like, I think it pointed us, or it gave us a glimpse of what is possible for the second decade of the project, because we just turned 10, right? 10 years old since we've been doing this 2009. So it gave us more fuel, this whole notion of using our body and presence as an object of useful agitation, that you are not thinking only on, based on I'm African or this, but you are thinking about what is, you understand duality, what can that do? We always say that we are Africans already, so that is not in question. But what will be in question is what we do with our Africanness. That's going forward. How we permeate the world, how we use that duality. And, you know, yeah, that's it basically. So I'll just keep it here for now. And like Tao said also, we get into conversation and we can expand even further.
Thank you so much, Emeka, because I also, for me, you know, the power and the beauty of course of those journeys, you know, is this really a kind of a process of going through, you know, like leaving from Lagos, going to Bamako, you know, or Dakar, you know, the kind of engagements as really a kind of a lived experience. But I also just handing over to moving, and I also want to come back to Utopia because you dropped it in the conversation now, so now we have to come back to it at some point. But also just to say that over to you, Mpho, and I think there's definitely already links also with your interest in narrative for sure. But if you want to take this one on.
Thank you once again, Storm and Zeitz for this invitation and for the great presentations or positions so far. It seems to me pretty obvious that Africa is an incredible place for people to innovate around models of exchange, models of mobility, even under conditions of scarcity and precarity. And one of my probably most enduring projects has been African Mobilities, that was preceded by a number of very small experiments in possibility and theory through Studio X Johannesburg, which is a Columbia University platform. But today I just want to talk a little bit about the many different dimensions of the African Mobilities project that started out as an exhibition, but was actually more of a distributed network that borrows very heavily from models like Chimurenga, but also BC Silva's Ashiko, in the sense of being like really distributed and being attentive to the kinds of asymmetries in knowledge production, access to networks, and even forms of knowledge on the African continent. So the exhibition really was trying to set a stage for the exploration of multiple ways in which architects and planners, theorists, artists, could grapple with what I consider a kind of epistemic closure around the ways in which African urban environments are often seen. In my own graduate education, Africa was always sort of like the object of development. And the narratives emanating from that place were often really sort of foreclosed by this kind of developmental horizon. And so a large part of my project was around, you know, exploding these narratives and creating other opportunities for different ways of narrating Black life. And so grappling with this idea of Blackness as ungeographic, Blackness as enclosure, but also Blackness as a site of radical possibility, which maybe speaks to a certain degree to your question around utopia. So the exhibition really tried to attend to this question of epistemic closure within the discipline of architecture and also popular discourse in the way that African cities, African architecture is represented, a very sort of limited vocabulary. And that has huge implications also in terms of, as an educator, in terms of students' spatial imagination, right? So that the only model for design is a kind of Euro modernity. As the kind of future that we can aspire to. Whereas the question for me was really like, what does it mean to be located on the African continent and to dream your own dream and to imagine your own future on your own terms? So that was the provocation and the invitation to all of my collaborators across the African continent and also the diaspora. So I reached out to people across multiple locations, and I was speaking to creative practitioners, theorists, scholars from 14 different locations that included Johannesburg, Harare, Kampala, Addis Ababa, Luanda, Abidjan, Lagos, New York, Dakar, Nairobi, Lubumbashi, Praia, and also the final, or at that time, the final platform, which was in Munich. And we really wanted to build a living archive and an archive for the future about African spatial imaginaries. And really not have any kind of a priori assumptions about what the outcomes of these inquiries around what it means to move on the African continent. So it was really sort of interscalar or multiscalar. So there were internal journeys, internal mobilities, internal transformations, but also this idea of grappling with border conditions, and not even taking the border itself as a kind of fixed entity, but rather thinking about border regimes, border conditions, bodies as borders. And then also taking the whole sort of temporality of the ways in which Africa is understood very seriously, where it's kind of like trapped in the past or living in an eternal present. So questions around sort of deep histories of mobility on the African continent that precede the language of crisis, that precede the language of the refugee, become really important in terms of like producing a vocabulary and a language for thinking about populations on the move, which is beyond the sort of sign of crisis. But also taking this question of being unhomed, which is a term that Nilika Jayawardene uses quite a lot. You know, what does it mean to be unhomed, and what kind of archives do people who are living in the diaspora draw on? And she describes this as a kind of poverty archive. But then also engaging with architectural historians and urban historians like Manuel Hertz, who presented a project called Highway Africa, where he really sort of introduces this kind of utopian 1960s imaginary that post-colonial African leaders had of like building highways across the entirety of the African continent. So even when I talk to my students in the present, like they can't quite grapple with the idea that at some point in our very recent history, there were national leaders who were imagining a highway that goes from Senegal all the way to Somalia. It's almost like beyond imagination for them now. And I think in some ways it speaks to the kind of mapping that Tao produced. So I think that all I'll say at this point is that whereas African Mobility started off as an exhibition, ultimately what it ended up as is a shifting platform, a set of events, a podcast series. We're looking at about 18 podcast releases from July to October this year, a mobile pedagogical platform, and also a transcontinental network that really sort of facilitated and supported new kinds of collaborations with practitioners, both on the continent, but also in the diaspora. So in that sense, it was kind of moving across these boundaries, but also like testing different kinds of border conditions and trying to create conditions of possibility for new ideas.
That's extraordinary. Thank you, Mpho. And I think there's definitely pickups there that I also think we will definitely come back to, certainly in relation to what I expect Edgar might also touch on, which would be, policy. But that's over to Edgar for now. But thank you, Mpho.
Thanks, Storm, and thanks to Zeitz MOCAA. It's wonderful to be here, and pretty daunting to go after Mpho, who's just, sort of been leading this incredible body of work. So yeah, it's wonderful to hear about that. And great to meet you, Emeka. Tao, I'm not gonna give a high five to because I speak to him too often already. So, and just for the record, we did not color code what we're gonna wear today. The man is in London, so I don't know what's going on. Anyway, that's the problem with long-term collaborations, right? Wardrobes align. So to sort of kick off on the point of urban imaginaries in the way you've framed this question about sort of how we think the future differently and the intractability of borders. So I just want to sort of throw in maybe a few conceptual points for us to think about, and I'm happy to then come back with sort of examples from my own practice and my work with Tao. So I'd like us to imagine that when we think about the futures, there's sort of different frames to that. So one frame would be probable futures. So this is typically the work of people in the scenarios business, right? The sort of consultancy firms who kind of extract ridiculous fees for telling people what the trend lines are when you sort of stack them up together. And these are narratives that sort of tend to what in the biz, as they call it, in the consultancy biz, they kind of create the burning platform, right? So you can see how fucked you are, and so that you can course correct, right? Whether you're a business or whether you a policy institution or whatever, because the world is burning down around you and you've got to enact your agency and so on. But that sort of trajectory, that imaginary of probability, really confines the world because it tends to speak the world from the position of the status quo, from the dominant trends, and from the sort of the narratives that are validated as the correct or the statistically appropriate way of imagining and projecting the future, data sets, longitudinal graphs, econometric modeling, and so on. The second one, I would say, is to think of the future as probable. What are the probable futures? So you kind of say, okay, we buy that, we've got to be scientifically grounded, we've got to think about these trajectories, but there's a margin of error. And why don't we focus rather on the margin of error and see what are the things that could potentially undermine that probable future or can amplify a certain dimension to get to a different outcome. And I would argue that a lot of what we've seen since the formal unveiling, if you will, of Agenda 2063 from the sort of formal position of African political leadership is in that space of the probable, is to say we've been endowed with a certain history, we're carrying the yoke of slavery, post-colonialism, blah, 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 we're marginalized in the global economy, etc. But we are going to take the future in our own hands, and we're going to show that by recalibrating our economies away from primary exports to a more diversified base, et cetera, embracing the knowledge economy, we're going to have a different outcome. But I would argue that that's still a fairly truncated view of the world, probably a necessary one to have. You kind of don't want your political leaders and presidents to kind of hang out with Emeka on road trips. You know, you kind of probably want them to pay attention to where the economy is going and to do what needs to be done with the IMF and the World Bank and the BRICS Bank and all of that. But, you know, the point is that the third area then that we can think of is what are possible futures, right? And this is the domain that both Mpho and Emeka and Tao have been talking about. These are the ways where we kind of compel ourselves to step out of epistemic assumptions and starting points that are predetermined, pre-given, and to try and either instantiate processes, experiences, affects that are completely unpredictable, unforeseen, and therefore generative of possibilities and imaginations and experiences that might have clues when they converge with other similar experiences about ways of interpreting, understanding, or experiencing, or reflecting. And of course, I would argue the finest artistic work we see across the continent, and to some extent, some of the most interesting design, are people who are willing to go and inhabit that incredibly dangerous and uncertain and speculative space. But if we think about it, right, that what the sort of the orientation towards the future that is interested in probabilities or in sort of what is plausible futures, they try and remain attentive to geopolitical conditions, right? They try and remain attentive to a political economy reading of the world. What I would argue people are interested in the possible or the impossible, if you will, are people who try and locate themselves or to produce forms of thought and experience that sits between the epistemological and the aesthetic. In other words, they're trying to suggest that there might be completely different ways of knowing that is either experientially grounded or is reactive to extremities. And that's what Africa is. Africa is a concentration of the most intense extremities, all geographically co-located within a long history of public neglect, right? And so people kind of have to fend for themselves, you know, the sort of, I guess, Emeka's, you know, the commercial hustle and, you know, the distinction from the person. That was beautiful, by the way. So I kind of wanted to just draw attention to that because I kind of want to put two provocations on the table. One is I think people who are interested in these alternative possibilities and breaking open the possibility for thinking beyond doesn't necessarily, I think, pay enough attention to the really important work that has been going on in the last decade on the sort of formal policy space. So like, let's think about it. In March 2018, 44 African governments managed to sign the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? And the deal was we have to have at least 22 nation states ratify this thing before it becomes real. That happened in May 2019. That is, I mean, by our temporalities and political, you know, sort of timeframes of how things happen, that is you know, we've got to all admit that's pretty remarkable, right? Within a year, we had that. And interestingly enough, almost all of the big economies signed up, except Nigeria. It might be that their Minister of Finance was on a road trip somewhere. But, you know, the point is that, you know, there's something there going on that is recalibrating the trajectories of African economies in a very profound way, because we need to be very clear, even though at the moment only 15% of African trade is intra-Africa, once this thing kind of gets its momentum, which it will, that's pretty clear, I think, if we read the political sensibility in the upcoming negotiations with the EU for the big sort of multilateral trade agreement for the next decade, you know, then critically, labor mobility will happen. And that's the thing, right? So we know that with globalization, it was cool for money to move around. It was fine for Northern talent to move around, but labor ain't, no way. Borders remain firmly in place. Globalization is about the flow of capital, not the flow of particularly poor or working class people. But for me, this is the interesting thing, because remember, this is happening on the back of a subterranean process that I think Mpho's work beautifully captures, where of course mobility of labor, of ideas, of all kinds of informalities is the norm. That constitutes African cities and city regions. So anyway, so the final point I then just want to make is, and I can come back to sort of some further examples, it's just that I think that there's something interesting to imagine at the intersection of these two ways of thinking about the future. And that is, for me, the most provocative thing that needs to arise in working with these different kinds of momentum and ways of reimagining or rethinking, is thinking of a geopolitical project where our mega city regions, the Gauteng city region locked in with Maputo, Addis Ababa, the East Africa cluster between Kampala, Dar es Salaam, and Nairobi, the sort of Lagos, Accra, Abidjan sort of links, Dakar, and of course Cairo, where those form geopolitical interactions that will outpace and accelerate the African project in a way that the nation state project under the aegis of the AU is just not able to deliver within the next decade. And because of the external pressures of climate change, of what's happening with the World Trade Organization and all of these different sort of mega trends, there will be a tipping point, I would argue, in the next 5 or 6 years, where that kind of political constellation, which is inconceivable at the moment, let's be clear, but where that will find traction. And with just 1 or 2 mayors or governors or premiers knowing what the deal is, you know, we can see incredible momentum. And I kind of want to just leave that provocation as a way of rethinking how borders will in fact be subverted and what kind of city regional solidarities might emerge. Thanks.
Thank you, Edgar. And literally, like, my head is exploding right now, you know, following all 4 of you coming through. I have almost an immediate question to you, just back on it while it's still fresh. But so you're basically saying that the city becomes then politically or economically the power player because it's able to then, what, kind of like get into a kind of relationship that outpaces a kind of like AU or kind of continental kind of like, so, okay.
So, yeah, so the deal is this, right? So the big thing we've got to solve is we've got to figure out how can we, so we're gonna sort of increase the urban populations by more than 100% in the next 25 years, right? And at the moment, we can only service about, maybe if we, you know, between 30 to 40, outside of South Africa, between 30 to 40% of the urban population with formal infrastructure systems, roads and sanitation and so on. Now that is just untenable. It's just not something that populations will accept. And it's just not something that is a viable proposition in a context where you want to grow economies. The rub is that you can't do what Europe has done or America's done with sort of modernist infrastructural development. We've got to do distributed systems. They've got to be low carbon. They've got to be materially efficient, and they've got to implicitly generate circular economies at a neighborhood scale, which informal economies in slums are very well primed to do. Now, but what that represents is a completely different generation of thinking about the urban system, urban economies, value chains, and so on. And that is a technological innovation, that is a cultural revolution, and that's an institutional transformation that has to be imagined, and that can only be built in relational economies between these big mega regions, because they've got the capital base, they've got the markets, and they've got the ambition to make those things the dominant technological approaches for Europe and America, you know, in the next 20 years. So that's what I mean. There's going to be a material basis for the political, geopolitical reorganization we can imagine. And the argument, I guess, that I'm trying to make is that if we can connect the kind of radical openness that Mpho and Emeka was talking about with a kind of city building that's required, that for me represents the most, you know, incredible potential to not just reimagine, but to kind of fundamentally instantiate materially different economies on the back of the infrastructural armatures that has to be built to address the need and to address the scale of these conurbations.
And Edgar, is the concern not that that this is also built on economic policies that replicate, you know, severe inequality and, you know, that perpetuate systems, perhaps?
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, let's be real, right? We fucked already. So how can you now kind of imagine that we somehow going to build these models that is not going to carry with it some of that? Now, that doesn't mean you don't do it, but what it means is that you pay attention to try and mitigate that. But, you know, you can't kind of try and imagine the perfect equal economic system or city functioning and then you act. That's not how the world works, right? We all kind of have to always have our hustle on the go while we try and make space and room for the fantastic alternative that we would love to spend all of our time on and imagine and do, but that's not how the world works. And that's not, particularly in an African context, an option, right? So the key thing here is that what I'm talking about is something that is deeply and profoundly informed by existing practices within these cities where people fend for themselves, where they build their own systems, they run their own institutional formats and so on. But what digital platforms will do, it will allow us to translate that into a deep code to begin to reimagine and if you will, tune the functioning of the city to enable these modalities of infrastructural provision. So there's sort of a whole set of very intricate dialectics that's connected there. And the form of that, the taste of it, the shape of it, etc., will be very different in others than to Cairo and so on. But there'll be a family resemblance that one can codify into what I think is an emergent economic model anchored in our cities, because that's how the global economy works, but that can fundamentally affect geopolitical dynamics. That's kind of the proposition.
Mpho, I don't know if you have an immediate response to Edgar. I sense so.
I want to fight Edgar.
Please do. I think Storm wanted us to fight.
I think you're being unfair, Edgar. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It's absolutely mind-blowing, and it's so wonderful that this project of a kind of networked Africa is coming full circle, almost like 60 years after it was initially imagined. And I would say that there is absolutely a kind of disarticulation between the sort of like geopolitical understanding of the world and also the kind of epistemological and the aesthetic. And in my experience, I haven't come across any radical planners. I haven't come across any sort of radical policymakers. I find a lot of suits, people who understand policy and geopolitics in very specific ways, but there's a kind of inability to think beyond that frame. And so the question around the epistemological is that I think it's also important to understand these geopolitical projects as epistemological projects that have their own aesthetics. So the attention to the epistemological and the aesthetic is actually trying to get at the code of the limits of the present, right? What you describe as the probable future. So the question then is not really about, for me, being more attentive to questions of policy, but rather how you get people who are trained to be policy specialists to be attentive to the epistemological and the aesthetic as a way of breaking open their own thinking. And I think trying to figure out what that is outside of a kind of masculinist understanding of knowledge production is really, really important. And I don't think that that we've quite cracked it yet, because there's a way in which like an understanding of the geopolitical is so muscular, you know, it's so like hydraulic in its force that it becomes really difficult to challenge, to undermine, to subvert, even though it's happening in everyday quotidian ways. So for me, the question is like, what form of articulation is required in order to produce this new paradigm? That's all.
Great, Edgar, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I think Tao, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to say, I think it's great to be optimistic, right? But there's also a gravity that we always have to get back to. I like what Edgar is saying, for example, about the 2063 thing. I am all for it. It sounds awesome, but let's sort of deal with the current realities we have. I'm from Zimbabwe, born there, and you know, it's very difficult to be optimistic coming in from an environment where the politics is just in this sort of state of stasis for a long time and is not getting any better. And I think Zimbabwe is not an exception. It's sort of like might be the extreme, but it's sort of like indicative of like a much larger sort of pattern of things. So my point is, how do we become as projective and as prospective and think about all the possibilities that are, and probabilities that are there, but also sort of like really deal with what's right in front of us. I do agree with Mpho about like different types of articulation, and I know this is something that Edgar is, he and I, we talk about this all the time, but how do you actually perhaps find a new language to speak about what's happening right now and shift that? Because we can't all be so focused on the future and think that the current moment fixes itself. I think we sort of like need to sort of like pull back a little bit, and yeah, that's me.
No, thank you so much, Tao. I'm also curious, Emeka, to hear from you. Is this the utopia that, you know, we imagined or imagined? But also, like, what is, how, you know, as cultural workers and practitioners, you know, like, what is our role within this, what sounds actually to me quite frightening, also, you know, and difficult. But what is our place here as those that make and engage as practitioners?
Well, first of all, let me take on Edgar for, you know, his analogy with the road trip, and saying, of course, that we don't expect the president to be on the road as opposed to being at the AU summit. But I think really, this is something that we have always said. You know, we traveled 2016 and 17, we traveled 28 states in Nigeria under our project called Borders Within. And that was the first time we said, okay, let us look at the borders within, you know, the country as opposed to going outside the country, because Nigeria is a very complex place. We know that. And of course, that amalgamation of the South and the North is still there until today. So the South to North transitioning is a very important, you know, transitioning, like crossing from the South to the North. And when we took off, we made these road trips, we realized actually everyone in Lagos who's talking about Nigerians don't know what they're talking about. Many people don't know what they're talking about because they've never traveled in the country. How can you talk about a country you've not traveled? You've not gone to the North. It's like a completely different country. And I remember many times when we said to ourselves that it is so easy for our president to go on a road trip in his own country, for crying out loud. He can do it. He has all the armies, he has everything, and really literally go on a road trip. And let me tell you why. Because in hindsight, when Wole Soyinka came back from the UK, the first thing he did was to get into his Land Rover and travel the country. Eventually, Wole Soyinka would be one of those artists, intellectuals who didn't have any stake at all in the Nigerian Civil War and the Biafran secession, who was very vocal about it. He sided or tried to play a role there. Of course, he was thrown into jail from where he wrote The Man Died. But now in hindsight, I'm thinking that was because he made that trip. So, I mean, why are we using big words here when we know that it's just getting into the van? You know, so they're not mutually exclusive. What is happening up there, policymakers and everything, and what is happening on the road, they are not mutually exclusive. So we can't set it up that way. That's first thing I want to say. We can't, you know, like make analogies that, you know, tend to undermine one for the other. You know, because the truth is, when you make that in Enugu, when we got to the east of Nigeria is a very, very important. Enugu is a very, very important state or city, because immediately you cross the Niger Bridge. It's a border actually, and that Niger Bridge was bombed during the Civil War. You know, that was the real border, and when you cross, you will know, you will see it. It still operates that way. And then the first thing we did was to begin to look at the landscape, the political landscape. It was an election period then. And so this governor was using, he called himself Buruburu, which means omnipotent, so omnipresent. That's basically his, you know, nickname. And rightfully so, his photographs everywhere, billboards everywhere, you know, it was ridiculous. But what did we do? We started writing about it. We didn't write about his policies, but we started writing and reflecting on how images are used in the public space in relation to the city, to the configuration of the city. So Enugu is a hilltop city. And is one thing we know in Nigeria, every hilltop has been occupied by the colonial government at the time. And it was because of this godlike complex of looking from, but also to have, so if it is not the beach, it is a hilltop. And so Enugu is a hilltop city. And if you go up the hilltop, you still see all those structures, those colonial structures. Everywhere in Nigeria, we will see that hilltop godlike. And so you also see that the religion was so central to his campaign. So he took on this godlike, omnipotent, omnipresent figure. But he was playing with the people's mind, and we know, so we started critiquing that. Now, of course, it was picked up on Instagram by the government. And then they pulled down one of the statues that was so ridiculous that because it was a statue that he multiplied himself into 5 places and put Jesus Christ in his midst or something like that. You know, and even using biblical quotations where he would now replace some of it with his own, with his name or with his referring to himself. We critiqued that, and by the time we left Enugu and we were nearing the border between Nigeria and Cameroon on our way out, we already saw that the government was already commenting about what we wrote and that image we made. And even till today, 2 days ago, they still brought it up again. We saw it, it showed up on Instagram again, where they are now trying to have a conversation with us to tell us that, look, the way we talked about those images and talked about the governor was not what is happening. So they tried to justify that. But then there's a conversation to be had there. And we are looking forward to having that conversation with them. Not because we want to critique them and say, oh, we want to condemn, but we have to create spaces for these conversations to happen. And I'm so happy that wasn't happening in the museum, you know, or in all those mainstream places. Mm-hmm. And that is what we are trying, hopefully, to achieve when we make this, you know, project. So that's one thing I want to say. And I think that's also the utopia. And for me, it's a needful utopia. It is not a utopia that, you know, you wake up in the morning and you think, oh, it's not attainable. You know, while we're preparing for this summit, Storm, you remember that during our conversation, I referred to, Toni Morrison's idea of, careful optimism. There is nothing, and that's also where I agree with Edgar when he said that, I mean, we already messed up. So there's nothing that says that there is nothing. If you look back, if you look, into the future, there's nothing that says that we'll succeed. But you do it anyway because you believe that's the world you want to see happen. And I think that, for me, that's the power of dream. And then we can now stretch that, into the power of critical thinking. And if you ask me, much of the work that we need to do, we can talk about policies, we can talk about all these things, but the truth is, like Mpho said as well, I mean, I've not seen any radical, I see suits everywhere. That's the truth, because someone like Wole Soyinka took a gun and went into the broadcast radio station and held it to the radio man's head and said, look, you have to play this one. This is it. I mean, Wole Soyinka in his time, So we can talk about Steve Biko. I've made this reference before, So, and when you look at it from that angle, we don't see any radical, we see suits only everywhere. But I think that there are a lot of young people who want to see what is possible. And they want to get a sense that it is possible without them having to go kill themselves or get themselves injured. Because we Nigerians, we say, Two-Face said it rightly, it's like, nobody wants to die, but everybody wants to go to heaven. So, and that's us, but how can we get, we're talking about the present again, Tao, because you talked about the present, right? But how can we get today's generation to feel like they wake up with their own revolution and then they pursue it? That's it.
Wonderful, Emeka. Thank you so much. I think a beautiful way for us to also segue almost into questions. There's quite a few that I see has come through, but I want to ask you very briefly, each one of you. Can you talk about one thing, one aspect of what you think is important about an important act of radical solidarity right now? Emeka, maybe if you don't mind, do you mind going first?
For me, I think that, first of all, I think self-love, very, very important. I have been preoccupied with that, thought these days a lot, because I've also been thinking about it in terms of what we do is an act of healing, of repairing. And it sort of like reminds me of what I picked up when Achille Mbembe was giving a talk sometime here in Germany, I think last year. He said something that is fascinating for him is that everywhere you go in the continent, people are busy repairing, mending something, using something and repairing and recycling. And it's so true. So this whole notion of repairing, and also because it is also something that's happening inside our bodies all the time. The cells are constantly healing us, repairing us. And I think that while we might not have the world that, we're supposed to have, that very, beautiful world that is supposed to be, I really think that there's no reason why there should be war and people dying and killing each other, because none of us is going to live, longer or beyond, like this planet, so we're going to die anyway. Since we are here now, so what is left is to repair, to heal, and I think that it begins with self-love. But also, I'm taking this from Bell Hooks that talks about how we have constructed a dominator culture. That what we are up against now is, a dominator culture. And when we bring in self-love, but also love in general, the practice of love, we are actually condemning and discouraging domination. And I think that's actually that's what we should always be looking for every time we come together. All the power plays, all the I'm stronger than you, all the I'll have to put you down so that I can be up there. You remove that from any relationship, you see that something magical begins to happen. And I think we need that more and more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Tao, over to you.
what do I consider an act of radical solidarity? I think sometimes our personalities just get in the way. I really think they do. You know, I think there's something to be said about humility and just as a way of being generally, because I think that takes you a long way. I had, but also just being generous. This is a story that I'm not embarrassed to share, but because it also speaks to some of the stuff that's been said here. I had an immigration problem in South Africa some years ago, and I ended up being stuck because of some paperwork snafu for a little while, and it's almost like survived a year, jumping from one place to another, different countries, different places, different people that had no need whatsoever to welcome me in. And that for me was one of the things that I will always be super grateful in my own life, in my own experience. It expanded for me the idea of what's possible. And it's sort of the sort of thing that I guess I'm holding on to right now, that at the end, we're also big. And I think we're bigger together, so yeah.
Thank you so much. Edgar, from your perspective.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I just need to first apologize to Emeka if I was just being flippant. I didn't mean to, you know,
no need to apologize.
I was just, sorry, I didn't mean to create the impression that, yeah, I was literally just making a joke. Yeah, so, and then I just want to respond to one thing Tao said. The response with Mpho will take much longer, so I won't do that now. But, so I think Tao, I'm surprised you think that what I said was optimistic. I'm not optimistic, right? For me, optimism is beside the point. It's completely irrelevant because, you know, we move between different states, right, of emotional intensity. You know, so I love the fact that I can be excited, amazed, surprised, overwhelmed by things. But I also know that that can very quickly become a state of profound depression, anger, anxiety, rage, and so on, you know. So neither of those things make me optimistic or pessimistic, you know, but I do understand that these are experiences and dispositions and things going on in the world. And if my life is about trying to understand myself and myself in the world and the world in me, then I have to remain open to all of these things. And so then pessimism or optimism is really beside the point. I don't want to, because one of the things or misunderstandings, I usually get misunderstood, but one of the misunderstandings I really don't like to let lie is the fact is to be accused of being optimistic, because it's not a useful, it's just not a useful thing.
So Edgar,
yeah.
So Edgar, I don't think I accuse you. How could I ever accuse you of optimism?
I know, exactly. So you of all people, I mean.
You know, so I have no problem with optimism. What I'm saying is, as much as we speak about the future, we also have to, you cannot talk about the future only without actually grounding it in the real now. So as much as we can, I would love to hear the 2063 idea. I'm sure there have been many 2063s. So why should we be so confident that that is possible when we haven't perhaps taken some time to look a little bit at backwards and seen where we have not failed?
Agree with you totally. I agree with you totally. And I think there's a beautiful symmetry between Mpho's example of that first post-colonial moment of developmental exuberance and confidence about, you know, these mega projects and plans, and the 16 mega projects that sit below Agenda 2063. There's a special agency linked to the AU and so on, that's implementing these 16 mega projects, which are, again, mobility projects, right? They connect this, that, and the other and so on. And they all have a business plan and targets and outputs and budgets and whatever. But and definitely lots of suits. But the point is that, so all I am saying, that's why I started with that one example of the compact, the ratification and momentum, because I'm trying to suggest that given our history since 1960, in terms of, sort of the abusive relationship we're in with our political leaders across the continent, right? And the kind of incredible, consistent practice of betraying just about every single promise, that there is something different afoot, which is not about a mindset change or about an ethical change or anything like that. It is a systemic question, right? There is an alignment of interest between elites and the need for Africa to play in a different league. And therefore, there's a set of processes underway under the guise of Agenda 2063 that is enabling certain things, which I think is ripe for us to subvert if we pay attention to it. But because we are so steeped in this profound skepticism, and I would argue an anti-developmentalism and anti-state, and for good reason, as I said, we've been in a 50-year abusive relationship with our political leaders. So why should we believe anything they say or suggest and so on, especially since the dominant form of politics remains extremely performative, right? I mean, they always putting on a show for themselves and their mates, right? And we kind of have to pay for that, it's so absolutely ridiculous. But the point is that there's something structurally, systemically shifting, which I think we haven't paid enough attention to, because we, I think, are trapped by the forms of critique that we've grown up in and that we have validated on a day-to-day basis, precisely because of the way in which, the abuse just perpetuates itself. So what I'm suggesting is, by thinking about these different ways of how the future is imagined and made, it opens up a crack to pay attention to different things. And then if we bring our artistic, our creative, our deconstructive sensibilities to that, I'm suggesting we can maybe even go so far as to be propositional about alternative institutional formats and so forth. And I don't think that has to remain rooted in the kind of, sort of absolutely correct critique that Mpho offered of the kind of, the sort of what she expressed eloquently. Yeah.
No, thank you.
So I'll skip I've used my 8 times.
No, I was just wondering if you trying to avoid my question. So if you don't mind.
I am actually, because I actually don't know what to say, to be honest. And part of it is, I know what I'm doing at the moment, which I think implicitly has an answer, and that is to try and figure out, what is possible as a kind of distributive project in Cape Town to allow Black young people to figure out how to tell stories about themselves and their histories and so forth, but to do it in a way that plugs them into a capacity to speak out as well, and to use kind of the location within the city and the experience of its spatialities as, the raw material for that. And I'm kind of doing a multiplicity of different things to try and figure out how to enable that. And I guess I'm doing that because I do believe that really paying attention and creating a somewhat nurturing environment for Black young people to find voice and tell story. And I guess, resonant of what Emeka was saying, is for me the most urgent work that is required.
No, thank you so much, Edgar. And Mpho, not unintentionally, you have the last word.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Edgar, for those clarifications around different kinds of articulation, and also the importance of being attentive to mechanisms, institutions, strategies for actually bringing new worlds into being, that it doesn't just sort of happen as an act of will, that there's certain levers and gears that have to be moved or created in order for that to happen. But in terms of my imagination about solidarity is really kind of informed by some Black feminist thinkers who, like Angela Davis, who argues that, and this is speaking largely to Tao, that we have to live as if the future is possible. right? And so, and for me, that has a lot to do with sort of snatching notions of futurity and utopia out of kind of Euro-American frameworks of utopianism without necessarily reproducing its pitfalls. That we have to allow ourselves the possibility to dream and the possibility to be utopian without feeling that like Europe is the horizon for what is and is not possible in kind of utopian thinking. If anything, the current condition, the shitty condition of the planet, calls for a radical reimagination, and I don't see how you do that without being willing to embed yourself in the present, but also have the capacity to project yourself into the future.
Thank you, Mpho, so much. I am going to ask Michael, a colleague, to just look through some questions, and we have a couple of minutes to respond to some of them. So Michael, over to you.
Good day. I have a question from an anonymous attendee. With respect to the notion of borderlessness, to what extent do you think that art biennales can / should be deterritorialized? Thank you. Deterritorialized, question mark, and then what extent can a national pavilion nurture mobility in the global south?
Who wants to take that? Emeka, maybe it's more in your direction.
Yeah, above my pay grade, that's for sure.
Well, I don't know if this answers it, but I already had something in my head. I was, like hoping to find a chance to like put out there. I also had before coming here is that, and I also want to put it out there because I am with all of you who are well invested in architecture and urban realities. So more and more over the course of even the last 2 decades, artists have been erecting spaces for exhibitions, for learning centers themselves, and they've used their apartments to create spaces of coming together, and they continue to do so. For instance, Ibrahim Mahama recently put up a beautiful structure in Tamale in Ghana. And what's interesting is that Tamale is in the north of Ghana. So if we are traveling by road from Lagos all the way, that's another stop for us to do projects. And we've always relied on these stops on the road trip. In fact, that's really like the core of the project, that we make stops and we try as much as possible to collaborate with artists. So you have Batlomi Togo that put up something in Cameroon. You have Godile with Art Bakery, and Giorgio Shodi in Lagos. So many artists. But what is interesting is that they are also putting these places, these structures on the road. They are really like actual, making sort of like connections, like nodes in that Trans-African highway. Literally, like, you can, whilst you're traveling, you can stop, you can collaborate. But at the same time, it's doing more. They are affecting, their immediate community, but they're also making connections and bringing people. So people can travel from everywhere, connections that Ibrahim's got now can come from everywhere, all over the world to come there. But at the same time, you see them doing things for the children of the community. And I know how this is so important because I still remember the only cinema in the city that I grew up in, the only one cinema. And if you tell me you are from Aba and I ask you and you don't know that cinema, then you're from there. And it's just one. And it has changed a whole generation. So I want to throw it out there. I want to say, it's like, use this to like, how do we say, use one stone to kill 2 birds. So I want to believe that this is the answer to that question. Asked. And then secondly, that is a question in and of itself. All right, so that.
Thank you, Emeka. Michael, is there other question or two for us?
A question from Sakisi Zwekina. How probable is Agenda 2063? What constitutes the tipping point to make it happen? Is it making Pan-African political rule a federal state?
I think, I don't know, for Edgar.
Sure. I have no idea is the short answer. And I think, sort of 2063, obviously the reason it's that is because it's the centennial anniversary of the forerunner to the AU, the Organization of African Unity. So then it will be 100 years since that very important political moment. So in that sense, it's arbitrary. And of course, sort of anyone who thinks about long-term future trajectories, will tell you a 50-year horizon is impossible to project. So I don't think that date is so important. It's about a directionality, and it's about trying to create a shared framework about thinking that if Africa operates as a bloc in a global context where Africa accounts for 2.5% of the global economy and only 4% of global trade, even though its population is projected to be around 30% of the global population by 2050, that disjuncture is so extreme that the only way that you can sort of elbow your way into that game is if you club together, if you become a gang, right? So Agenda 2063 is really just to try and figure out, because the project to become a gang at a regional level, the West African Union, the SADC and so on, has only been successful in East Africa and Western Africa. And the Western Africa issue is very much related to the common currency and the relation with France and all of those complexities. Let's not go there. But the point is that for the rest of it, the sub-regional things haven't really worked that well. It's been pretty much a failure. So I think the idea here is to say, guys, the stakes are so high. If we want to really break the back of the asymmetries in the global trading system and the global economy that keep us on our knees, we've got to kind of club together so that we can, in geopolitical terms. So I think it's trying to cohere that, and it's fascinating within that frame, just to tell one anecdote. If you look at what Kagame is doing within that framework, tiny economy, tiny country, but how he's using Rwanda as the sort of mimicking itself as the Singapore of Africa and as the forerunner for the sort of fourth industrial revolution discourse and so on, and is building a geopolitical bloc around a special initiative around the fourth industrial revolution, which has 11 heads of state on its board, right? So it has no formal diplomatic status, but it is a think tank within that project where Kagame is using that as a mechanism to say, I'm the intellectual brains of this Agenda 2063. So I think, the point that I'm making is, it's a frame that is reorienting the terms of political contestation and collaboration on the continent, that it will catalyze certain initiatives around broadband, around hydro projects, around renewable energy projects, and so on. But whether it will be able to build a different conception of citizenship that can potentially lead to forms of governance that are different, it is way too early to tell. And I think part of the issue is that a lot of non-state actors is not paying attention to this thing, right? People are kind of just ignoring it. And that's, I guess, the point that I'm trying to make.
Thank you. Michael?
How might we articulate an African paradigm of art that is sustainable whilst embracing mobility?
So now it feels like we're on Jeopardy. Really difficult questions get posed. It's like, I hope they don't ask me.
Mpho, are you comfortable with answering that? We can also get...
I mean, I don't have any answers for anybody. I don't know anything about anything, but I just want to go back to this discussion that Edgar has offered around being attentive to policy proposals like Agenda 2063, and how those also need to be used with sort of critical but also creative critique. And I think that questions around art also have to be thought, art and architecture have to be thought about in relation to relations of production. So that one actually begins, if I think about it from an architectural point of view, for instance, you know, when people think about modern architecture, it's almost always about this architecture that is produced through imported materials. But if we actually begin to think about different kinds of aesthetic production from the level of like value chains, local economies, that begins to produce a very different, potentially different aesthetic sensibility that is very sort of rooted in economies and resources that are on the African continent. So you have some practices like what a young collective in Dakar called Warafila, or somebody like Mariam Kamara, or Jean Chartal, who's very interested in thinking around endogenous technologies, endogenous materials, local materials, in order to produce architecture. And that has implications in terms of skill, in terms of education, in terms of employment, all kinds of value chains that basically get opened up. So I think that the question around sustainability has to do, and I'm not making an argument for a kind of parochial localism, but rather thinking about how we can change this extroverted relationship that Africa has to the rest of the world in terms of trade, and even in terms of ideas to a certain degree, to thinking about what is it that we can actually produce ourselves, and then take that out into the world and participate in those kinds of networks and circuits of exchange.
Thank you so much, Mpho. I think we have time for one last question, Michael.
A question from Shilimbembe. Thank you very much. Thanks for very rich reflections. It looks as if each of you, in particular Edgar, Emeka, and Mpho, have an idea of why we have so many borders in the continent and how we could open up the continent. Could you please be a bit more explicit in terms of how this should be done? Is there any way in which the continent could harmonize its various migration regimes?
Thank you, Michael. I don't know who wants to go first, but great question.
So yeah, so just sort of as the technocrat on the panel, let me do my thing. So I think so again, just to sort of, so the one piece, of course, is the common trading market, but there's actually 4 work packages linked to that. So one is the common passport idea. The second is what is called the African Open Skies regime. And then the third relates to the reform of the AU itself, because there's a recognition that, of course, the AU fundamentally is related to the nation state architecture. And that if you're serious about this, you'd have to reform that. So there's kind of a working group that is trying to think through that. That's the least developed. But from a sequencing point of view, it's very clear that the evidence will come from the common trading agreement and the kind of building into a vested interest, into a much greater interdependence between regional economies as the precursor to the common passport idea. But just, there's the work on the back end work on how the alignment of visa requirements, border controls, all of that stuff, the technical work on that is pretty far advanced. I mean, there's very detailed proposals and formulations on this, but no one politically sort of thinks that that is going to be a reality until there's significant momentum around the common trading market and the open skies policy. Yeah, so that's just sort of, but obviously, again, to, I guess, underscore just the importance of thinking through some of these concrete things, sort of a completely open border, diplomatic open border context would obviously be unbelievably enabling for all kinds of things in terms of our respective practices. But it is conceivable, I think, within a decade, maybe 15 years on the outside, would be my read.
Thank you. Mpho, do you want to respond to the question? No need to. And then Emeka, do you have any responses as well to the question?
Well, I think that it is important that we continue to or we hold, we hold really seriously that this notion of Africa as a story of journeys, and that in everything that we do, that we have to think beyond an Africa that speaks only unto itself, because that's not our narrative anymore. There's this, what are we going to do with this duality? I think it's so important. And if we add, to the fact that, like Mpho have already said here, like I've already said, that the power to dream, if you bring those two together, and then think of, that traveling or moving is not mutually exclusive to being in one place in that sense, then we begin to approach, the complexity of our continent, of our way of being, of this way of thinking, but also knowing that you can even flip it and think in a reverse psychological way. It's strength, and I think that is important. And then let's also think of this whole notion of reparation, constantly, because that's what we see, that's what we do every day in the continent. And it's already obvious that I'm not always speaking from, like from the big numbers and the policymakers. That's not where I'm speaking from. Speaking from, everyday encounters. Like recently, yesterday, I was having a conversation with he's not a young, he's a Ghanaian who lives in Morocco now. He speaks English and French fluently. He learned to speak French in Senegal because he was traveling. He crossed the desert by road, but then decided to stop in Senegal. And then eventually he moved, after 7 years, he moved into Morocco. And now he has a platform called Minority Globe, where he is animating and bringing artists together. And he was telling me concretely that before he came there, they didn't even know a lot of people. He met, the people he works with are people who are looking to go to Europe. That's all they have in their mind, and he's meeting all those, human smugglers, people who are partaking in that chain of, who are stuck in that, parenthesis that you never come out from. But then he came and he introduced something. It's like there's art. He's a musician. He brought in theater, and then all of a sudden, these people started to see how they can occupy their time differently. But then he animated the social power of that space, and now things are happening. We're talking about sustainability again. They are now, he said that before, that it will be Europeans that will come in to do all the events at the hotels and things like that. But today, they call him to get musicians. And these musicians were once people who wanted to travel and go to Europe, but now they have started practicing, learning, and then he is bringing people in to give workshops, to teach. We are looking to collaborate with him. But what I find very interesting about his story is that everything we're talking about in Invisible Borders, he has lived. So I am relating with him not from a place of, there's one level of we are artists trying to do something, but it is also because our interest, because our real life, interest and preoccupation is finding an anchor in the way we live our lives. So when he wakes up in the morning, I know what he's going to do with his time. It's not going to wait to conceptualize, because it is his reality. And for me, I think those kind of stories has to be valorized. And that brings me to the next thing. My thing is that what I always say is that our biggest problem in the continent is misplaced priority and not knowing how to value what we have or our own process. Our process is different. How we arrive at things, it's cut and join, it is DIY, but we're not valued enough. The moment we have a chance, we go to the West where we get all the whole equipment and all that, and then we throw away that we don't articulate. And that is the reason why I started, the podcast, because it's important that we articulate, archive all these processes, all these artists, all these intellectuals. That's what the podcast is about, so that we can have a trace of how, if you listen, it's a long form podcast. If you listen to the podcast, you see that what we're discussing is how did you arrive at being this artist? We want to articulate that. We want to hold it and say, 20 years from today, someone will say, this is something that needs to be studied and seen as value, as seen as part of the practice. So it's not so much about, you know, what we need to do next. It's about how we valorize what we're already doing. And it also joins to what I was saying about all these artists who are busy erecting spaces here and there. Big institutions like Zeitz MOCAA needs to support and work with them and see that as real value, because Zeitz MOCAA will be working with the mainstream and the big people. But their process, their way of arriving at art, of practicing it, of doing it within their communities is different. But there is something very important there. And if we do not put value in it, then it will be written off. It will be written off. It won't be part of history. So I think that we're already doing that. Everywhere I go, I see that we're already doing that. But who is valuing it? Who writes about it? Who is the curator that says, this, I will throw my weight on it? Who is the artist who says, this, I will throw my weight on it without, you know, trying to, you know, disavow its form, you know, and the way it operates within its own context?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. And I think, just so you know, that we take these comments very seriously, and that we are in the process of institution building that's also about reflection and self-criticism and engagement, and also, as you said earlier, also with humility. So thank you very much. And with huge humility also, thank you to you,
Sorry,
Emeka.
one small anecdote, one small, just 1 minute. You see, the thing is, if I was called to do this, maybe with the past directors of Zeitz MOCAA, I probably wouldn't be here, because I was, you know, their intentions were very questionable to me. But today is Koyo, who convened all of us here, you know. And the reason why I say this, the point I'm trying to make is this. The first time I met Koyo was in 2003 in Bamako. Then in 2004, I was in Dakar, in Senegal for the first time. I was in her house for 3 days. What I find very interesting is not just about hosting a young artist who she met, but is the way she animated her house. And it became a space for me as an artist. So when I'm thinking back in hindsight, and thinking of the things that sort of like giving me my consciousness and my self-awareness as an artist, I think of moments like that because I had access to her library, books, everything. So that's another thing. You see that artists all over in the continent, they construct their living space, having that in mind, that when artists come in, it's going to be a learning space for them. It's going to be a space for togetherness. They're going to benefit from that. Little things like that, you have to begin to put value. When we make our residencies, you have to also put into account those kind of methods, you know, as value, because it is really value in our own reality. There was no photography school in Nigeria. So we were picking it up everywhere we went. And Koyo's house was one of it. And you can draw a line from that place, from that house, from that library, to what she eventually did withdraw, the space, and then she's now in Zeitz MOCAA. That's how it moves. And that, for me, is what all of this is about, you know, from my own perspective. But if you don't value it that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Emeka. That's a beautiful, beautiful anecdote and reflection as well. And absolutely big thank you to Koyo for also, you know, this forum itself. I need to end the session, unfortunately, with 4 beautiful minds and voices. Thank you so much, Emeka, Tao, Edgar, Mpho. I really, really value, and we're super thankful for your contribution. Thank you very much. Before you log out as audience members, please, I would like you to introduce you to Phokeng Setai, but thank you again to our panelists, and we will just go on to the introduction of our listening session. But thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And so while we wait for Phokeng, I think he'll log in now and just introduce the listening session. Phokeng, if you're around, now would be a good time. Just to say that our next session is a listening session curated by Chimarenga, entitled FESTAC 77. On the sidebar here, you will see the link will be posted momentarily, and then later at 8 o'clock tonight, I will be giving a reading. So see you back to then. But here, over to you, Phokeng.
Thank you, Storm. Thank you so much. Thank you for facilitating such a wholesome and important conversation. Thank you to all the panelists for a very cerebral conversation, very stimulating. And thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Phokeng Setai. I'm a doctoral fellow at the Center for Humanities Research and a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of the Western Cape. My task this evening is to provide a contextual background or introduction into the deep listening session we're about to have. And this is what I will do as of right now. FESTAC 77 is the second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture that was held from the 15th of January to the 12th of February in Lagos, the capital city of the state of Kanuda, Nigeria. The origins of FESTAC can be traced back to the anti-colonialist ideals of the African Society for Culture, which in 1956 and 1959 promoted the first and second congresses of Black artists and writers in Paris and Rome respectively. Altogether, the festival had 45 Black African, Arab, and Caribbean countries represented at this major event. It saw the participation of countries such as the United States of America, Brazil, the West Indies, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Afro-Aborigines of Australia. The festival covered music, dance, cinema, drama, literature, popular dressing, a literary congress, and a fashion show. It was a momentous spectacle of African culture and a vibrant explosion of Black expression. FESTAC 77 gathered the world's most outstanding Black academics who intermingled with internationally renowned jazz musicians, singers, actors, painters, and sculptors from across the African continent and the diaspora. Much like the purpose of the museum being a place of meeting or coming together, a place to promote debordalization, as Professor Chilim so incisively said during his conversation with Judge Sachs and Executive Director Koyokuyo on Monday, FESTAC was a context zone of that moment in history. To further highlight the significance of this event, it is imperative that I briefly relate to you the political backdrop of this incredible festival. Of course, the role of Nigeria played, the role that Nigeria played in hosting the festival is central, and it evinces how essential the role of the West African country was then and still continues to be today. Some people today quip and say that Nigeria is indeed the capital of Africa and the Black world. In 1946, Nigeria was entering a period of heightened emphasis on decolonization, and a fervent spirit of Nigerian nationalism was building. In 1960, this period of specific focus on decolonization and Nigerian nationalism came to an end as Nigeria gained its independence from Britain. This was 2 years following Ghana being the first African country to receive independence from European colonialism in 1958. The political momentum of the 1960s was accelerating rapidly, as the 1960s is the decade that so many African countries gained their independence. These political currents heralded important new trends in African politics. FESTAC 77 provided a key backdrop to the imminent changes that were about to ensue. The prudence of the decisions made by African leaders during the 2 decades of the 1960s and 1970s led to a turning point in modern African politics. FESTAC 77 was, of course, not the first event of its kind. In the year 1966, President Leopold Sedar Senghor and the Senegalese state sponsored the first World Festival of Black Arts in Dakar. As unique and important as this festival was, it received stinging critique for confining the festival to Black Africans, mainly those south of the Sahara, and thereby omitting the participation of our Arabian brothers and sisters to the north. Subsequent to the inaugural 1966 festival in Dakar, there came a series of periodic gatherings of Black and African people from all over the world. These were organized by the Organization of African Unity, and they are namely the Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers in 1969, the 1974 Zaire Music Festival in Congo, and eventually FESTAC in 1977. The festival cost almost $1 billion to organize, but FESTAC was too big an event in its cultural implications to be measured solely in financial terms. It was a huge step in the direction of African and global integration. The festival, the cultural exchanges that occurred during the festival were immense. The participation of Black Americans in the festival came out of the acknowledgement that there was a direct relation between Black power in the US and Black power in Africa. This festival wanted to do something that Dakar 66 had failed to do, and the festivals of 69 and 74 had begun initiating, and that is a Pan-African economic and political community. The Pan-Africanist mood of FESTAC 77 allowed for the extension of the spirit of Pan-Africanist solidarity towards Black people in apartheid South Africa, but also solidarity with Palestine. Organizers strongly believed that joint Black and Arab participation might strengthen the anti-Israel and anti-South African policies of the time. The call for Afro-Arab unity was indeed critical in standing in solidarity against hegemony, but it was also a key geographic criterion. FESTAC was not only a cultural Olympiad that provided an opportunity to show the vigor of African arts and customs, it was a search for identity through an exploration into the discursivity of culture through its many elements. I am reminded of Edouard Glissant's quote I found in his book, Poetics of Relation, that says, "You learn more about yourself through encountering the other." FESTAC 77 had far-reaching consequences in the future, and I want to express my gratitude to the people at Chimurenga Factory for reviving this rich archive. The Sankofa bird is a vital component in understanding the essence of African ontology. Looking back to move forward, the bird as a symbol of freedom is a deep provocation that asks us to question how do we think, or asks us the question of how do we think with the archive to make sense of the present. Chimurenga Factory in their work have been offering alternative answers to this question and many others that we are faced with in the field of social and cultural politics today. For those who may not be familiar with it, Chimurenga is a contemporary cultural organization that focuses on Pan-African cultural production. The platform has its headquarters in Cape Town, South Africa, and the name comes from the Shona word for struggle, resistance, and revolution. Its many components include a quarterly publication, an online radio station, and periodic happenings and exhibitions, just to name a few things. Chimurenga is a magnet where all things converge and a paragon of generative collaboration in a cultural economy that tends to be extractive, exploitative, and seeks to divest the human being of whom they are. My elder, Mpho Matsipa, if you're out there, is the spine of this absolute gem of Black African cultural production on the continent. Before we play the mixtape, I would like to say a few words about it. The official FESTAC 77 mixtape produced by Mpho Matsipa, and the good people at Chimurenga as a sonic collage comprising music and excerpts of interviews, an alchemy of voices from the past and the present. You can expect to hear from interesting characters such as the likes of the writer and theorist Kodwo Eshun, the jazz trumpeter Ahmed Abdullah, and the legendary songstress and political activist Miriam Makeba. Composed in a non-linear structure, the mixtape is a collective audio archive, a decomposed and arranged reproduction of a festival that has profound historical importance in the context of African cultural history. I personally like to think of it as the B-side to the A-side. That is the book that came out earlier this year. To tune into the mixtape, please click on the link in your chat box. You'll listen to the mixtape on the Mixcloud, and please join us afterwards for the reading that will be given by our senior curator, Storm Janse van Rensburg. He'll be reading from Ivan Vladislavich's The Exploded View. Thank you very much.